All right, welcome back, everyone. Ms. Nickel, please continue.
Thank you. Musical chairs. I will be addressing my questions for this portion to Ms. Smith, and I'll try to fit it within my original time estimate, but it might take a little bit longer. Ms. Smith, did you discuss your testimony with any of the witnesses that presented during part one of this proceeding?
Yes, I did.
Which witnesses?
Dr. Nader Tarani.
Anybody
Yeah.
else?
I guess most of the people on this panel that were presenting, we all shared our testimony, at least the presentation of it.
So this panel.
Yeah.
Did you discuss your testimony with Maureen Sargent?
I did not discuss my testimony. I cannot remember if she was at the rehearsals when we were presenting our oral testimony, though, so I don't know if she saw it or not.
So did you ever have a conversation with her about whether or not the changes in the DSM-2 modeling results that are in your testimony would change any part of her testimony?
I did not.
Can I have DWR 306, please? And this is a document titled "The Contract Between the State of California Department of Water Resources and the North Delta Water Agency for the Assurance of a Dependable Water Supply of Suitable Quality." Are you familiar with this document?
Yes, I'm relatively familiar. Haven't read it for a while, though.
That's okay. Is it your general understanding that DWR is obligated to meet the requirements of this contract in its operations of the State Water Project?
It's not my area of expertise. I know it's a contract, but I'm not sure of the legal constraints that we have.
And are you aware that this contract contains certain water quality criteria?
Yes, I am.
And is it your general understanding that those water quality criteria apply year-round?
I'm trying to remember exactly what those criteria were. I'm not sure if they apply year-round or not, but I do know there's various different criteria and throughout several months. So.
And are you aware that the criteria apply in September, October, and November?
I believe so, yes.
Thank you. Is it also your understanding that the water quality criteria of this contract, when they apply in September, October, and November, that is a period when there are no water quality requirements at Emeton under D1641?
Yes, I believe so.
Thank you.
Okay.
Did you conduct any analysis to determine whether or not DWR would be able to meet the requirements, the water quality requirements of this contract under the Waterfix operations described by CWF H3+?
I did review results for Emeton, 3 Mile Slough, Rio Vista, and what's the third one? Oh, and Emeton, and then there were 2 or 3 other locations.
The locations that are identified by the contract?
Yes, that's correct.
And does any of the analysis that you just described for 3 Mile Slough appear in the materials that you've submitted as part of this proceeding?
No, it has not.
Is there a particular reason why you didn't submit those materials?
Because I just recently reviewed them.
So recently, within the last week, last 2 weeks?
Last week.
Okay. And based on that review, do you recall whether there were any significant differences between the results at 3 Mile Slough and what's been presented here?
Well, in what sense that the objectives are slightly different? Do you want to? There is not a 3 Mile Slough up here. Could you clarify that?
I'll try, and then what I'm interested in is whether or not in your review of the 3 Mile Slough results, whether there were significant differences in terms of the increases in EC that would be would occur under the CWF H3 plus scenario over the no action alternative.
Yes, I noticed that there's I would say a 5% increase in frequency of non-compliance over the no action alternative, approximately,
And how are
give
you
or take.
how are you defining non-compliance?
You know, similar to those graphs that I showed previously where you have the non-compliance graphs and you see where you take the run minus the objective and then you have a zero line. It's at that zero line where there's about a 5% difference.
And by non-compliance, are you talking about the water quality criteria in this contract
Yes,
at 3 Mile Slough?
yes.
Okay. And was that a 5% increase based on a long-term average?
It was, yeah, it was based on the 16-year average, yes.
Okay. During part one, we heard Dr. Nader Turani describe various modeling anomalies. Did the DSM-2 modeling that was conducted for CWF H3 plus correct any of those anomalies?
No, not as relates to the North Delta.
Were modeling anomalies corrected for other aspects of the modeling?
I don't think so, but I'll ask Dr. or Mr. Reyes if he's aware of anything.
No, none that I can think of. I don't think we specifically tried to address modeling anomalies for Cal Waterfix specifically, or for H3 plus Cal Waterfix. For Cal Waterfix H3 plus.
Did you address modeling anomalies for other projects or other aspects of the modeling?
I don't think so. At least to my knowledge, we haven't made any significant updates to the modeling logic.
But have there been non-significant updates?
For instance, for the we have a model study that we released from my group that's called the Delivery Capability Report. We updated certain contract entitlement numbers for the SWP. And this is for year 2017 with some very minor updates to those numbers, but no, not to any logic.
Would you categorize that as sort of routine updates to the model?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Smith, is it your understanding that the DSM-2 modeling for CWF H3 plus does not account for real-time operations that may be required to meet the water quality requirements of D1641?
Yes.
Is it also your understanding that the DSM-2 modeling for CWF H3 plus does not account for real-time operations that may be required to meet the water quality criteria in the 1981 contract that's identified as Exhibit DWR 306?
Yes.
In the modeling analysis that you presented, I think we looked during your direct testimony, we looked at analysis that was based on long-term averages over a 16-year period of record. Did you do any modeling analysis on a shorter time step?
In what sense? Can you clarify?
Sure. Let's talk about your analysis of the project's ability to comply with the D1641 requirements at Edmonton. Did you analyze those results on a time step shorter than the 16-year period of record?
Well, within that period of record, we're looking at the 14-day running average. We're looking at monthly averages. In that sense, yes, we did look at that.
Okay. It may help to pull that stuff up. Let's look at DWR 1015. This is your written testimony at
Okay.
page 19. In line 4, you state the monthly average EC results for CWF H3 Plus during the months of October and November are similar to those under the no action alternative with slight variations. Can you explain what you mean by slight variations?
It's pretty qualitative. If we could bring up a graphic on that, and then I could explain a little bit more.
Sure. Should we perhaps move to page 21? I believe that's the graphic figure EC1. Is this
So we're comparing the California Waterfix to the no action alternative. So the pattern is very similar, but the California Waterfix is higher than the no action alternative.
And so you said it was a qualitative analysis. Did you conduct any quantitative analysis to determine what the level of increases of EC would be?
No.
So your opinion that there would only be slight variations is based on a qualitative determination and not a quantitative threshold.
Yes, within that testimony, yes.
Can you describe for me what, in your qualitative analysis, what you would consider to be a significant increase in EC?
I would, I guess if I saw that there were significant increases in non-compliance, that's where I would, or if there was a difference between the compliance, a significant difference in the compliance, then that's what I would consider a significant difference.
And I think I heard you testify earlier that when you reviewed the modeling results at 3 Mile Slough, you determined that a 5% increase in noncompliance with the 1981 contract was significant. Is that correct?
I don't know if I said it was significant. I said there was a 5% difference.
Okay. Would you consider a 5% increase in noncompliance to be significant?
I don't know. I think it, in the sense of, is that a bigger deal on whether or not the department will be able to achieve the compliance? I don't think it's significant, just based on what was presented by operations and by what Dr. Nadir Tarani had put in his rebuttal.
So did you conduct any analysis to consider whether any real-time operations that the department might engage in to reduce that 5% increase in noncompliance down to 0 or something close to it, what the effect of that would be?
No, I've not done any analysis on that.
So looking at this figure EC1, this is the monthly average EC at Emiten. It's shaded out in blue here, but let's look to the months of October and November. It looks like to me that the pink bars are higher than the black bars, which would indicate that there's a increase in the CWF H3 plus scenario in the monthly average EC at Emiten over the no action alternative. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And have you quantified how much that increase is?
No, I have not.
And are you aware that this level of increase would increase violations of the water quality criteria in the 1981 contract?
I saw that there was an increase in non-compliance through the analysis I did recently. I'm not, because this shows the difference, I can speculate that is a contributing factor, but I haven't really connected it.
Okay, so when you looked at the 3-mile slough results, you didn't do any analysis to see what the cause of that increase was?
Yeah, I didn't look at the time periods when the exceedances were occurring.
And did you look at what the cause of those exceedances were?
No, I didn't. That would be related to the time period when I see that.
Can we go to page 14? Apologies, I don't have a line number. I think it's down, yeah, it's lines 13 through 16 about. In this portion of your written testimony, you testify that for Prisoner's Point, the NAA meets or is less than 0.44 millimoles per centimeter, EC, approximately 98% of the time. And then you go on to testify that under CWF H3+, it meets that standard approximately 87% of the time. So this is an increase in the violation of D1641 by 11%, correct?
Objection calls for legal conclusion as to violations.
I think we heard Ms. Smith testify in her direct testimony that the 0.44 millimeter standard is the standard, the objective under D1641. Is that correct?
That's the objective, I would say, exceeds the objective.
By 11% of the time, or 11% more of the time, correct?
Yeah, I've got to look at this again to do the calculation, so.
I'm comparing the numbers 98% and 87%.
Yes, okay.
And does it sound about right to you that that would be about 9 of the 82-year period of record in CalSim, correct?
I couldn't say that that's how I would look at it.
Okay, we'll stick with
Yeah.
11%. We don't need to do any other
Yeah.
math. Okay, can we have NDWA 400, please? And page 7. Just for reference, and I should have done this on the first page, Ms. Smith, this is a rough transcript of your direct testimony that you offered last week. And if we could move down to the bottom of this page. Here at line 23 to 24, you describe this as a modeling anomaly or artifact. And then let's go to page 18. Go down. Sorry, I didn't write the line numbers down. Okay, sorry, line 9. And here you say that Prisoner's Point is not one of the locations that has a flow salinity relationship simulated and therefore was not captured by the modeling. Can you point to me where that is in your written testimony?
That's not within my written testimony. That was in Mr. Munavar's testimony in DWR 7071.
Okay, I'll go check that. Let's look at page 17. And here you say, this is lines 15 through 19. The exceedance occurs primarily in dry years, whether the San Joaquin River salinity is higher, and it is my opinion that the removal of water at the northern intake locations is not the reason for the higher salinity on Prisoner's Point. Can you point that to me in your written testimony?
I don't believe that I said that in my written testimony.
Okay, I would, on that basis, move to strike that opinion at lines 15 through 19 as improper surprise testimony.
Mr. Mizell?
I believe that Ms. Smith was explaining the modeling results at the time. I would have to go back and see if the results are self-evident, and she was merely putting those results into English language instead of numeric language. But this is something I wouldn't be able to do here.
Let's,
If I may respond, I read this as an additional opinion. If we'd like to compare the written testimony on the results at Prisoner's Point, in her written testimony, you will see that there's a description of various operational criteria that are the basis of the opinions regarding Prisoner's Point. And here Ms. Smith is offering a new opinion that it has to do with something other than operational criteria of the project. And that was not contained within her written testimony.
Mr. Mizell, do you still need time to review her testimony? She has just admitted that it's not in her written testimony.
I mean, the witness can speak for herself, but I would say based on the first part of that sentence where she's describing the year types in which it occurs, that it may have been a description of what she was observing in the modeling data, but outside of additional time to review and find out the basis of the statement, I can't describe it now.
Ms. Smith, what is the basis for the statement?
Well, because the basis of the statement is because we saw what was going on in the San Joaquin River, that it was my opinion that the North Delta intakes weren't the reason. Specifically, I did not list that the North Delta intakes as part of my written testimony, but I did discuss the San Joaquin River salinity being higher and how the water, or how the other tributaries, rivers, sloughs fed into that area that include the Northern Delta. So I didn't specifically say the North Delta intake location in my testimony, but I did talk about the impacts on the San Joaquin salinity. So there's kind of two parts of that. I don't know if that made too much sense, but
If I may add, her written testimony on page 14, lines 19 through 21 indicate that she stated it was due to Southern Delta diversion export reductions and the closure of Head of Old River Gate. That would be something, that would be operations other than the North Delta diversion points. And so I think it's simply another way of stating what's in her written testimony.
I see that now. Do you see that, Ms. Nickel? on
I
page
see that, but
14?
I think they are different, and perhaps I can ask a few further questions to understand.
Proceed, otherwise your motion is
Motion.
overruled.
I may renew it.
For now, it's overruled.
Okay, so let's pull up the written testimony at page 14. DWR 1015 at page 14. Lines 19 through 26. And there, as Mr. Mizell just read, you describe various operational criteria. Are those operational criteria part of the California Waterfix project?
let me look at 19 through what,
23,
okay.
maybe all the way through 26, but
Okay, let me look at this. Okay, I read it. What was your question again?
are those operational criteria that are part of the California Waterfix project?
Yes, those are part of the entire project.
And so wouldn't it be fair to say that those are causes, that the causes of the effects that you're seeing here are caused by the project because they're part of the operating criteria?
I was just being more specific onto what the specific causes were, so that we would understand better what is going on in the system. So if you're saying that the whole California Waterfix H3 Plus project as it was described, yes, the California Waterfix H3 Plus as described, yes, that is the difference. if we're saying what parts of that project are, then I'm describing what the parts of the project are.
Okay, that's helpful. And so in your oral testimony, let's go back to your oral testimony. Where were we? Lines 15 through 19. And actually specifically when you talk about 17 through 19, you don't, you're not basing that, strike that. Your opinion is not that that it's not caused by the project in any respect. It's just the aspect of the project involving diversions at the northern intake that are not causing the effect. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. As so limited, I withdraw my motion if it was still pending. Can I ask you now about lines 15 through 16? The exceedance occur primarily in dry years. Is that in your written testimony?
No, that's just from looking at the data.
Okay.
Or I don't know, it may be in my written testimony, but it's from looking at the data.
Okay.
Yeah. It's hard to remember what I put in my written testimony, so.
Time estimate, Ms. Nichol?
A few minutes.
Okay.
I'm going to move to the water level results at DWR 1015, which is Ms. Smith's written testimony at page 28, lines 16 through 17. And here you testify that the results for CWF H3 Plus are very similar to H3 and H4 with only slight variations. Again, can you describe for me the threshold by which you determined that they were only slight variations?
Could we bring up one of the graphics?
Sure. Which one do you want to?
Just, I guess, move down, maybe the one that's closest to the intake. So just downstream of the intake, the probability of, I'm not sure if it's.
So figure W1
Yeah,
on
yeah,
page 30?
the frequency plot, and the next, maybe down a little bit more.
Yeah.
There we go. You can see a slight difference in the color, and that's what I say is a slight variation. They're basically kind of on top of each other, but you can see a little bit of purple and through the blues and stuff, so.
And is that again based on a qualitative analysis and not quantitative?
Yes, it's a qualitative analysis.
Thank you. I have nothing further.
Thank you, Ms. Nichol. Let me make sure. Group 10, 11, 12. All right. Ms. Tabor, you are up for group 13 and 22, I believe, right?
Thank you. Kelly Tabor on behalf of Group 13, the Sacramento Regional County Sanitation District, and Group 22, the City of Stockton. And I have about 10 questions that will be addressed to Mr. Miller relating to real-time operations. Mr. Miller, you testified that real-time operations that would occur under the California Waterfix include interagency coordination, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. And that interagency coordination does not include a process for coordinating with the Sacramento Regional County Sanitation District. Is that correct?
There is some groups that do have other stakeholders that are welcome to join.
And do any of those groups include the Sacramento Regional County Sanitation District?
Sacramento Regional is welcome to join, but I don't know if they are part of that group or not.
And when you say that group, did you have a particular group in mind?
That's what's called the DCT, the Delta Conditions Team.
Okay. But you don't know whether there's a process for them to join that group? Is it open to anyone?
It's pretty much open to anybody, yeah.
Okay. And does that, can you explain how membership in that group might influence real-time operations?
So the DCT provides stakeholders a place to speak their mind on various different things. And so then the representatives from, say, Fish and Wildlife Service. That's the one. Oh. And NIMS can listen to those opinions, and they can bring data or whatever, and so then that through that forum, then the Fish and Wildlife Service and NIMS are able to bring that to the Water Operations Management team.
So am I understanding that that particular stakeholder group exists for the purpose of informing the fisheries agencies, who would then bring concerns to the DWR operators?
DWR operators are on that team as well.
Okay. And is participation in that group limited to operational issues that affect fish and wildlife?
I'm sorry, what?
Is participation in that group or the subject of that stakeholder group or the subject of their discussions limited to issues that affect fish and wildlife?
Not necessarily. No.
Okay. So are you aware that for, I'll just call them regional SAN to save time here, that for regional SAN, one of the issues of concern in this hearing is the effect of reverse flows at the point of discharge from the Sacramento Regional Wastewater Treatment Plant? So would the DCT committee be the forum where an entity like Regional SAN would raise issues like that to the project operators? Issues meaning reverse flow impacts?
Are you talking about with a California water fix in place?
With the California water fix in place, yes.
That could be one of them, but then there's also a additional group that's proposed to be created specifically for operations of the California water fix facilities.
Is that group described anywhere in DWR's testimony, to your knowledge?
I think it's described in the final EIR/EIS.
Okay. Do you have, or does anyone on the panel know where that, in the final EIR/EIS, that would be described? It's a big document, as you know.
I forget if I referenced it or not. Oh yeah, so thank you, Mrs. White. That'd be SWRCB 102.
Okay, but you're not aware of anything, a more specific reference within that?
Table 3-35, maybe on page 3-277.
Okay, great, thank you. I will look at that. So would that DCT process or stakeholder group that you mentioned also be a forum for the city of Stockton to express input on the effect of water fix operations?
Well, the DCT is something that we have today for today's operations. And so they're not talking about Waterfix in today's operations.
Is it your understanding that DCT would evolve to encompass Waterfix operations?
I would imagine DCT could evolve to encompass Waterfix operations.
But to your knowledge, there's no other process or protocol that has been established as of today that would specifically provide for input from stakeholders such as Regional San or Stockton to
Objection asked and answered. He's explained that another group will be created once California Waterfix is up and operating.
And what further do you need?
Okay, that's fine. If
Okay.
that's Mr. Meisel's, I wasn't sure that I understood that correctly, but based on Mr. Meisel's representation, that is the answer, I'll stop with that.
Not that Mr. Mizell is testifying, of course.
No. So you've also mentioned, Mr. Miller, that you have tools that help inform real-time operations decisions, correct? The California Waterfix, as it's currently proposed, does not involve any process or protocol for evaluating whether Project California Waterfix operations would cause reverse flows at the location of the Sacramento Regional Wastewater Treatment Plant, correct?
Are you asking whether modeling has been done to determine that?
No, I'm asking whether you have any process or protocol for monitoring that when the project is operating.
We will have to put in additional monitoring for the Waterfix facilities, and that will certainly help inform any potential.
Is there a specific mitigation measure or operating condition that covers monitoring of reverse flows in the area around the Sacramento Regional Wastewater Treatment Plant, to your knowledge?
I have no knowledge of that.
Okay. And you mentioned the need to implement monitoring. Does the California Waterfix as currently proposed include any protocol that would include modifying operations at the North Delta diversions in response to those monitoring results?
Yeah, I think that would be that would be part of some of the adaptive management in terms of monitoring for biological purposes, but maybe you're not talking about biological.
Well, no, if you, and you may not be familiar with Regional San's testimony, but they have operational concerns related to the effect of reverse flows. And I'm just trying to understand if they're within your testimony or understanding of how real-time operations work, if there's currently any thought given to how to address reverse flow impacts at Regional San's intake, or discharge, sorry.
I'm not aware of any thing set up to reflect your question.
Okay. And I guess similarly, those tools that you mentioned to inform the real-time operations decisions do not include a process or procedure for collecting or evaluating water quality data at the City of Stockton's drinking water intake on the San Joaquin River, correct?
So the tools that I'm primarily talking about are, say, like DSM-2. And so hopefully I'm not speaking for Tara or Ms. Smith, but typically the more data we can use to feed those models, the better it can perform.
And are you aware of any protocol to collect or evaluate data at the City of Stockton's drinking water intake and shape California Waterfix operations in response to that data?
I'm not aware.
Okay, thank you. Just two or three more questions. So the combined, and this goes to how you would operate in the face of uncertainty or changed conditions. As I understand it, the combined capacity of the two conveyance tunnels that will be constructed is 9,000 cubic feet per second, correct?
That's my understanding.
Okay. And that is the California Waterfix H3 plus capacity that's been modeled using the CalSim model, correct?
That's my understanding.
Okay. One, if there's a correction to that or clarification, I'd ask anyone else on the panel to jump in. If there, Mr. Miller, is a problem with one of the tunnels, or one of the tunnels is out of service, being repaired, and the Waterfix is operated with only one tunnel at any given time, then I assume that only 4,500 CFS, or half of that 9,000 CFS capacity, would be able to be exported via that single tunnel. Is that correct?
Objection. This goes well beyond Mr. Miller's scope of knowledge. This is a question that should have been asked of the engineers, since they're the witnesses we've provided to discuss the construction details and the physical specifications of the facilities.
Well, it does, in my view, this goes directly to operations and how the operations are modified in response to changing conditions. Mr. Miller has testified that he is here as the witness testifying about real-time operations. So if he is able to answer it, I would appreciate an answer.
Overruled, Mr. Mizell. Mr. Miller, to the extent that you have analyzed the scenario that Ms. Tabor is describing, then please answer her question.
Okay, and I may have misspoke about the capacity of the particular tunnels. It's the capacity of the three intakes. And so I don't actually know the capacity of the individual tunnels.
Okay.
That would have been a question for Mr. Minarski.
Okay. So you don't know, as the person in charge, at least of the state water project operations, how much water would be or could be diverted through one of the tunnels if something were to happen to and make the second tunnel unavailable for use?
I don't know the capacity of each individual tunnel.
Okay. Then I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Tabor. Number 14. All right. 15, East Bay Mud. We're up to you, Mr. Salmon. You have requested 2 hours. To the extent that your cross-examination is productive, we will proceed along that line. But please note that I do want to give the court reporter a break. What do you say, Debbie, in half an hour? Okay. So find a good time between 2:45 and 3 o'clock for us to take a break, please.
Good afternoon. John Salmon for East Bay Municipal Utility District, Group 15. I am here with Fred Etheridge, also representing East Bay Mud. We have questions for 4 witnesses on this panel. I will be asking questions of Mr. Reyes and of Dr. Greenwood. Mr. Etheridge is going to be asking questions of Mr. Miller and of Mr. Wilder. And there may be a good time to break. I mean, we can break any time, but after I finish up with Mr. Reyes, it might be a good time.
Yes, that might be a good time, and I would suggest that, Mr. Miller, you come back up during the break so that you don't have to keep holding the handheld microphone. And would you quickly run through the topics you'll be exploring with each witness?
Sure, all up front. For Mr. Reyes, I'm going to ask him about OMR flows, CVP deliveries, and the effects analysis. For Dr. Greenwood, I have questions about the reasonableness standard, the project impacts on in-migrating adult salmonids, and project impacts on out-migrating juvenile salmonids.
And I'm Fred Etheridge for East Bay Municipal Utility District. And for Mr. Miller, I will have questions on real-time monitoring and the input of fisheries information to operators. And for Mr. Wilder, I will have questions on the rivers he examined in his testimony and project impacts on waterways.
Thank you.
Could we please display Exhibit DWR 1016 on page 11? And let's start on line 14. So, Mr. Reyes, this is your testimony, correct?
Is this Exhibit 1028?
This is Exhibit 1016.
Oh, 1016. My testimony, yes, it is.
And here at line 14, you've referred to figures 29 through 36 as depicting the OMR compliance frequency. And this is just a housekeeping matter. Did you intend here to refer instead to figures 27 through 34? I ask you because I'm going to ask questions about these figures.
Sure. Could we pull up DWR Exhibit 1069? And if you could go to figure 29 or whatever figure was referenced in my testimony.
So you referenced 29 to 36. I just want to confirm that you meant 27 to 34.
Yeah, if you can go back to 27. Yeah, I must have mixed those up. At one point in time, these were all in my testimony, and then I took them out to create a separate exhibit, so I think the numbering was off when I did that.
Okay. Thanks, I appreciate the clarification. This exhibit, DWR 1069, is part of your written testimony, correct?
That's correct.
Does this exhibit describe the inputs and assumptions for the CWF H3 Plus modeling released on November 30th?
Could you repeat that question?
Yes. In this exhibit, do you have a table that describes the inputs and assumptions for the CWF H3 Plus modeling released last November?
Not in this specific exhibit, no.
If I might interject, we can go to page 1 of exhibit DWR 1069, and there's a table of scenario inputs and assumptions.
That's the table I was referring to.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
So that contains the inputs and assumptions for the CWF H3 Plus modeling?
That's correct.
Okay. Can we take a look at figure 32 in this exhibit? I think it's on page 55. And this is one of a series of figures, the ones we just identified that describe OMR compliance frequency. Mr. Reyes, can you please explain what this figure demonstrates?
This figure was intended to show compliance with an OMR standard. So essentially, if you were above that 0 reference line, then that means you were in compliance or doing better than the standard. And if you're below, then you were not in compliance with the standard.
The horizontal axis, is that the exceedance probability?
Yes, that's correct.
And what is the vertical axis?
The vertical axis is the difference in in the flow between the simulated flow and the standard flow.
And the OMR requirement, is that represented by the horizontal red dashed line?
Yes.
And then go on.
Yeah, it's the standard, but I mean, not that the standard is 0. It's if the difference between your simulated flow and your standard, which is what is being plotted, if that difference is 0, then you are exactly meeting the standard. But the standard itself may fluctuate between minus 5,000 and minus 1250 or something. I forget the exact numbers for the standards, but so I'm not representing the actual flow standard here. It's whether we are complying with a flow standard.
If the pink line or the black line is exactly in contact with the standard, which is the horizontal red dotted line, does that mean that at that point in time, the project is exactly meeting the OMR flow standard?
That's correct.
Is it fair to say that the farther up the vertical axis those curves go, and that is the farther away from the flow standard? Is it fair to say that the farther up you go, the less negative the flows are in the OMR?
Yes, I would agree with that. And I think I know where you're going with this. I mean, so there's an issue that I had with these charts, and I didn't get them corrected before we came here. There's nothing really wrong with the information, but what it is the black line is a comparison of the simulated flow to the BIOP standard. The pink line is the difference between the simulated flow and the new increased standard. And that's a mistake on my part. I should have also compared that against the BIOP standard. And then you would have seen where the pink line would then be above the black line. And I've already replotted these, and I can confirm that that's what it is. I mean, at some point I'll try to reintroduce that information, maybe on rebuttal. I don't know what the process is, but
So as of this point, that information is not in the testimony or exhibits that you've submitted?
it's not. But I was trying to show that we are in compliance with the OMR with these charts. I mean, that was my objective, and that I still say that's still true.
Okay. Can we look at the next slide? So this is a very similar OMR compliance chart for the month of May, correct?
Correct.
And we see the same trend here?
And the same thing, yes.
Okay. And the NAA is further up the vertical axis than the H3 plus scenario in general? on
Yes.
this? And we saw the same thing on the April slide, correct?
Right. So the first slide is all the months. So yes, you would see the same thing.
Okay. So you mentioned that these two modeled scenarios, the NAA and the H3 plus, are actually, I believe you said that there are different flow standards depending on which scenario you are modeling. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And did you say that the NAA was the OCAP BIOP OMR standard and the H3 plus was something else?
That's correct.
Okay. I'd like to ask a few questions to try to pin down which flow criteria was assumed in each of the, or particularly in the H3 plus scenario, and how it might be different than or the same as the NAA. So the table at the beginning of this exhibit indicates that the NAA modeling used the OMR criteria from the 2008 and 2009 BIOPS. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that same table, perhaps we should look at it. It's bottom of page 4 and top of page 5. So if it's possible to get them both on the screen, these two pages. Maybe that's not possible, but it breaks across. So for the H3 Plus modeling, the CWF H3 Plus in particular, I believe what this shows, although it doesn't all appear on this page, and please confirm if this is correct, is the modeling applied for October and November the same as the NAA, so that is the OCAP BIOP OMR flows. And for all other months, it applied the same as H3.
That's correct.
And that's what shows on the next page, that latter part. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then in turn, H3 is a setup where either of two sets of OMR criteria may have been applied by the model. Either some new criteria that appear in Table 3, which we haven't looked at, but it's a new set of criteria, or it could have at times applied the same OCAP BIOP OMR flow standards as appear in the NAA, as were used in the NAA. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So going back to that chart, can we go back to page 55 of the exhibit? This again is figure 30. Can't see that. It's the OMR compliance for April, figure 32. So can I tell from looking at this chart on any particular point you might choose along this curve which OMR flow standard is being applied by the model for the CWF H3 Plus modeling run?
No, you can't, not from this chart.
Is it possible that some of the data points plotted on that pink curve here representing H3 Plus could be the same flow standard as the NAA?
Yes, it's possible.
Also, did the NAA scenario plotted on these curves assume that the OMR flow standards for the NAA are no more stringent than the existing standards from the OCAP BIOPS?
Could you repeat that question?
Well, I think I've already asked it. Is it possible that a newer, more stringent OMR flow standard could be imposed in the future, even if the Waterfix project is never built?
Objection. Calls for speculation and was asked and answered on panel 1.
I'll withdraw the question.
Thank you, Mr. Salmon.
I'll move on to my next topic. I'd like to ask Mr. Reyes some questions about the similarity among the results of different modeled scenarios, and particularly with respect to CVP deliveries. Can we display, please, Exhibit DWR 1016, page 3, starting on line 7, where Mr. Reyes lists his opinions. Mr. Reyes, I noticed that when you list your opinions here, you use the word similar several times to characterize the differences between the NAA and H3 Plus. Do you see that?
Yes.
For example, on line 25, you said, quote, simulated long-term average deliveries to CVP and SWP north of Delta and south of Delta water service contractors were similar or higher than NAA under CWF H3 Plus scenario. Can you explain in this context what you meant by the word similar?
Sure. Let me try to get to that chart. Yeah, if we could pull up DWR Exhibit 1028 and go to page 55. So this is an example of SWP north of Delta deliveries, which would be what I would call a service contractor delivery. And when I mean similar, they're very close. The NAA, if you look at the long-term average, is 1189, and the CWF H3 Plus is at 1200. So it's an increase of 11,000 acre feet long term. And for various water year types, you know, as I visually look at them, they're very close, and these total numbers are not far from the no action, and so that's why I said similar. But they're not exact. They're not the same exact delivery.
So it sounds like that was a subjective interpretation on your part of the data.
Yeah, so visually looking at it, that they look similar to me.
Okay, so you didn't apply any quantitative criteria.
No.
Okay. By calling the water deliveries similar, did you mean to say that they're not the same?
They may be the same in some instances, and I think they are. So no, I did not mean that.
But in some instances, they are not.
That's correct.
Okay. I'd like to focus on one example in particular. On line 27 of your testimony, the page, which page were we looking at there? Page 3. Starting on line 27, you state that the H3 plus scenario resulted in less than 3% reduction of the annual deliveries to the north of Delta CVP service contractors compared to the NAA. In your opinion, are the deliveries still close enough to be similar despite a cut of nearly 3%?
Yeah, from my perspective, I mean, from a macro scale, it's similar. I mean, some criteria is within 5%. I don't know what an exact criteria of similar is, but yeah, that's.
But in your opinion, this qualifies as similar?
It does, yes.
Okay. There's a chart that depicts this particular result. It's in Exhibit DWR 1069 at figure 49, which is on page 72. This chart shows average annual deliveries to north of Delta M&I CVP contractors, correct?
That's correct.
The column labeled BN, does that show deliveries in below normal water years?
That's correct.
In below normal years, this chart shows deliveries would be reduced by an average of 5,000 acre feet under the H3 plus scenario compared with the no action alternative. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And all the acre foot numbers on this figure are averages of model output for the entire 82-year model run. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Could reductions in some individual water years be greater than the averages shown in this figure?
In individual water, yes.
Could we please see Exhibit DWR 1068? Thank you. This exhibit is a full-page enlargement of Figure 2 that is also a part of your written testimony, correct?
That's correct.
Can you briefly explain the purpose of this figure?
At least as far as how I use it in my testimony, I was just trying to highlight the data flow and maybe the interconnectedness of the different models that were used in the effects analysis.
Can you describe what is in the upper left corner box?
That upper left corner box is meant to represent the hydrology and system operations type of models, which is in this case CalSim 2.
Does CalSim 2 feed output into the other models depicted on this figure?
Yes, it does.
And the other boxes on this figure, do they generally represent other models that are utilized as part of the effects analysis?
That's correct.
Has this analytical framework of utilizing all of these modules been consistently used as part of each CalSim 2 model study for this project?
I believe so, as far as the different, along the progression of the EIR, I believe it has been.
Was the effects analysis done in connection with the modeling prepared for this hearing?
To that, I'll have to defer maybe to the folks that have done the effects analysis, so like some of the biologists, sorry.
The biologist, is there anyone sitting on this panel who would be aware of that?
Can you repeat the question, please?
My question is whether the effects analysis depicted in this figure on DWR 1068 was done in connection with the modeling prepared for this hearing.
Which particular modeling are you referring to as far as prepared for this hearing?
It could be either or the modeling prepared for part 1 of the hearing or new modeling that has been prepared in connection with part 2.
Objection, vague and ambiguous. The department presented, this is very sensitive to the word P. The department presented modeling both for the the BA H3+ and the CWF H3+. We submitted both of those modeling runs, both to the parties in the hearing as well as to the public at large. So if Mr. Salmon could please specify, is he referring to an effects analysis done for one of those two modeling runs? Dr. Greenwood might be able to answer the question more readily.
I think Mr. Salmon is trying to determine whether or not this framework was used in all the effect analyses that were conducted.
In all of the modeling that was conducted, yes. I'm of the understanding that this complete effects analysis was performed for modeling prepared in connection with the biological assessment. Is that correct?
That's what it says on the title.
Right. Now, my question is whether this same suite of effects analysis was performed in connection with the modeling performed for this hearing. And I don't think it's vague or ambiguous which modeling was prepared for this hearing.
I'm going to reassert my objection. It's vague and ambiguous because we submitted two different modeling results for this hearing. If Mr. Salmon is referring to the CWF H3+, then he needs to state that. If he's referring to the BA H3+, he can state that as well.
Both.
That was my understanding of his question. Overruled.
So yeah, as I indicated earlier, most of the biological analysis, which would include things like DPM, which is the delta passage model that you see in this figure, were done for the BA H3+ modeling scenario. And as I mentioned earlier, as far as the biological modeling, the ITP application included a modeling run that had the spring outflow criteria for CWF H3+ applied to one biological analysis, specifically the longfin smelt X2 abundance relationship. That's the extent of biological modeling.
Do I understand your response to mean that some or all of these effects analysis were not performed in connection with the CWF H3+ modeling?
That's right. Not all of the biological models that you see in this figure were performed for CWF H3+.
Do you know why not?
the analyses that we're basing our opinions on, depending on the different topics that we're looking at, we've made as I gave in my summary testimony yesterday, I gave an overview of why I thought that what we had, the BAH3 plus, was a reasonable representation for CWFH3 plus, whilst acknowledging that there were differences. So the CWFH3 plus biological modelling wasn't undertaken because our biological analysis had been completed for the biological assessment and for the ITP application.
The CWF H3 plus modeling differs in some particulars from the BA H3 plus modeling, does it not?
It does.
Is it possible that had you performed the suite of effects analysis on the CWF H3 plus modeling that the results of that effects analysis would have been different?
The results would be different, certainly, but as I laid out yesterday in my introduction to my summary testimony, where I compared several of the important physical outputs from the calcium modeling that compared the BAH3 plus to CWFH3 plus, it was my opinion that they're sufficiently similar to still be able to draw conclusions. The results would differ, yes. But in my opinion, they're sufficiently similar to draw conclusions and make opinions.
But your opinion is not based on an effects analysis. It's not based on performing an effects analysis, correct?
That's correct. As I mentioned, the only biological analysis that I've conducted to this point for the CWFH3 plus as represented in these documents is what I described, which was the one analysis contained in the ITP application.
I have no further questions for Mr. Reyes. I do have questions for Dr. Greenwood. I could turn to those, or we could...
And how long do you estimate for the cross-examination of Mr. Greenwood? Sorry, Dr. Greenwood.
Maybe half an hour.
Then we are definitely taking a break.
All right.
We will resume at 3 o'clock. All right, everyone, please take a seat. Couple of housekeeping items before we return to Mr. Salmon. With about another hour and a half or so, but in any case, Mr. Salmon and Mr. Etheridge will be our last cross-examination being conducted for today, and we will resume tomorrow. We'll be back downtown, and tomorrow we will begin with, oh, by the way, I just got a late but not untimely, from the San Joaquin Tributary Authority, group number 18, to conduct cross-examination. And they've requested around 20 minutes, or estimated around 20 minutes. So we'll begin tomorrow with group 18. Then group 19 has switched with group 25. So after group 18, we'll have the County of Solano for roughly 30 to 45 minutes. After that, unless other people show up, we'll get to Mr. Herrick, group 21, for 45 minutes to an hour. Then group 24 for about 20 minutes. Group 25, who is now 19, Ms. Meserve for land, has requested around 2 hours. Mr. Jackson has requested around 3 hours. I expect that's the most we will get to, but if we, for some miracle, we get through all of that, then we will get to NRDC with an estimated 2 to 4 hours. And we will be back in the coastal hearing room tomorrow. Good? All right. And also, I need to get back to Ms. Desjardins. We said earlier this morning that we would get back to her various outstanding motions and requests after lunch. We did discuss it during lunch, but we don't have a final response for you, but you should expect it later this week. Right? Are there any other housekeeping items we need to discuss, aside from the fact that by being here today, we all missed the hailstorm that is happening downtown? All right. With that, I'll return it to you, Mr. Salmon.
Thank you. I have some questions for Dr. Greenwood now. If we could please display Exhibit DWR 1012, Dr. Greenwood's written testimony. I'd like to focus on footnote 2, which is at the bottom of page 3. Dr. Greenwood, do you recall this footnote in your testimony?
Yes.
It discusses the standard by which you analyzed effects on fish species. Is that correct?
Yes.
And did you apply a standard of reasonableness?
Yes, I believe I did.
Did you use a different standard of reasonableness for listed species as opposed to unlisted species?
Essentially not. And I can expand on that, which I think would be useful.
Please do.
As I noted yesterday in my summary testimony, my consideration for reasonableness was based on, for example, with the biological modeling, capturing existing regulations, existing requirements under Endangered Species Act, as represented, for example, in the 2008-2009 biological opinions, as well as the requirements of the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan, D1641. The standard I applied in forming my opinions is in relation to the comparison with the no-action alternative for those, essentially, the no-action alternative including all of those things I just mentioned. So reasonableness would be the comparison of the Waterfix CWFH3+ to the no-action alternative.
For listed species?
This is actually for all different species.
Yeah, I understood. That was the first part of a question. I apologize. For when you were looking at listed species and analyzing the impacts of the project alternative to the no action alternative, were species that did you determine for the listed species that there was no unreasonable impact? In other words, that the project met the standard of reasonableness based on whether ESA requirements were met, pertinent biological opinions, and other applicable requirements? And I'm quoting from your footnote. Let me rephrase that. Were those requirements that you refer to there, the BIOPS, the ESA requirements, and the other applicable requirements, including Fish and Game Code and Water Code, were those the standard of reasonableness that you applied with respect to listed species?
Yes, and also unlisted species. As far as to the extent that, as I just mentioned, the no action alternative represented these different requirements, the comparison was to the no action alternative. So even for unlisted species, the results of the no action alternative would consider or would reflect these different requirements. So the examples that I showed yesterday for species that are not listed, for example, striped bass, American shad, others, the modeling for those includes not only D1641, but it also includes the biological opinions as well. So ultimately, informing my opinions, even for the unlisted species, this considers it considers all of the different things that were captured within the modeling.
So to the extent a species, even an unlisted species, was analyzed in a biological opinion, that analysis in the BIOP informed your reasonableness analysis, is that correct?
Which particular biological opinion are you referring to?
I'm not sure. You've referred to them generally. I'm trying to get
Oh,
a sense
sorry,
of
okay.
how you're making your reasonableness determination. And right now I'm asking about listed species in particular.
I was just trying to indicate what so the basis of comparison was the no action alternative. And the no action alternative includes, for example, and I think this is where the biological opinion reference is what was confusing. I was meaning capturing the effects of the criteria that are included in the 2008-2009 biological opinions that were represented in the no action alternative that then formed the basis for comparison of the CWFH3+.
For unlisted species, what else informs your definition of reasonableness? What did you look at for unlisted species to determine whether an effect on that species is reasonable or unreasonable?
I mean, it's primarily the same. It's this comparison to the no action alternative.
Comparison
of the comparison of CWFH3+, as it may have been represented, at least in my. I'm forming my opinion, as I mentioned yesterday, based on different modeling. So, in the case of the EIR-EIS for the unlisted species that I mentioned yesterday, I showed results for H3 and H4 that were sort of bracketing CWFH3+ and indicating that I felt that those gave a representation of CWFH3+. So, again, these unlisted species included consideration of the no action alternative as the basis for comparison, as the point of comparison from which to assess reasonableness, from my opinion.
Right, and you've mentioned there that you've compared the no action alternative to the project alternative, the CWFH3+, I presume, to determine whether there is an impact and what the extent of that impact is. I have it correct so far?
Yes.
Okay. So what threshold did you use? Was this a quantitative analysis of the modeling results from each of those two scenarios to determine whether an impact is reasonable or unreasonable, or was it a non-quantitative judgment that you made?
The quantitative modeling that we have, of which I gave some examples yesterday, forms part of the consideration, part of the opinion. But then in some cases there are additional considerations as well regarding the extent to which the modeling, the quantitative modeling, can be used to form the full opinion regarding a potential effect.
Is there anywhere in your testimony or the exhibits where the standard of reasonableness that you applied is defined? I don't necessarily think so, no. Okay, so for each of the opinions in your testimony where you have concluded that there's no unreasonable impact, you did so by comparing the no action alternative to the project alternative and making a determination that that the impact is reasonable or not unreasonable.
That there would be reasonable protection by CWFH3+.
But not based on any quantitative analysis that is, or even quantitative standards that are part of your testimony.
As I mentioned, it's the comparison to the no action alternative, which is the basis for my assessment of reasonableness.
Okay, I'd like to ask you a few questions about in-migrating adult salmonids and the Waterfix project's potential impacts on them. When you prepared your testimony, did you examine Delta cross-channel operations under California Waterfix project conditions?
Yeah.
Do you understand the BAH3+ modeling to indicate that the Waterfix project could result in increased DCC openings during the fall months?
Yes. I understand that the modeling shows that.
Can you explain the term straying, your understanding of that term as it relates to in-migrating Chinook salmon?
Straying would be when in-migrating or upstream migrating adult Chinook salmon return to a water body that is not the one that they were born in.
Can the Delta cross-channel operations, in your opinion, cause or contribute to straying of in-migrating adult salmonids?
I've seen reference to the potential for that to be the case, yes.
Did you conduct an analysis of how Delta cross-channel operations under Waterfix project conditions would affect the straying of in-migrating fall-run Chinook from the McCullummy River?
We do have consideration of that, yes.
Where is that analysis of McCullummy River fall-run Chinook as it relates to Delta cross-channel operations in your testimony?
Actually, it's not in my tests. I don't believe it's specifically in my testimony.
But you said you did give consideration to that? Is that what you said?
My testimony doesn't explicitly consider Delta cross-channel operational effects, but they are discussed in Appendix 5E of the biological assessment.
Are you aware of whether that appendix discusses McCullummy River salmon specifically as it relates to Delta cross-channel operations?
I believe it does, yes.
But you have not conducted any analysis in connection with your testimony or this hearing with respect to effects of Delta Cross Channel
Objection.
operations on McCollum River.
Objection, compound. If we could take it based upon testimony and
Sure.
evidence for this hearing.
Sure. Mr. Salmon?
Yes. Have you conducted any analysis of Waterfix project? Pardon. Have you conducted any analysis of the effects of Delta Cross Channel operations as they relate to the Waterfix project on McCollum River salmon?
An objection asked and answered. He indicated it's in Appendix 5E.
I'm asking if the witness conducted any analysis.
Please answer.
Yes, Appendix 5E.
That was you who conducted that analysis?
Yes.
Do you have an opinion about how the Waterfix project may affect DCC operations as they relate to migrating McCollum River fish?
My opinion, I think, would be informed by the analysis shown in Appendix 5E, which we can, if it's helpful, we could pull it up and look at it.
But it's not in your testimony, correct?
It's not specifically referenced in my written testimony, no.
Okay, I could move on. If there was if a significant portion of McCollum River Fall Run Chinook strayed into other systems, could that impact the production levels of the McCollum River Fall Run Chinook fishery?
Can you repeat the first part again?
If a significant portion of McCollum River Fall Run Chinook stray into other systems, in your opinion, other rivers, in your opinion, could that impact the production levels of the McCollum River Fall Run Chinook fishery?
Vague as to the meaning of significant portion.
How are you defining the fishery in this case?
The fishery that is Fall Run Chinook salmon of McCollum River origin.
Overrule, Mr. Mizell.
In the hypothetical situation that a large portion strayed, then I would assume that it could affect the fishery, although I'm still not exactly clear what's meant by fishery.
Is there a certain level of increased straying that would exceed the standard of reasonableness?
I would have to consider that. I would have to consider that further. I don't know.
Is there some level of increase that is reasonable within the standard of reasonableness?
I'm not sure. I don't know.
Can we see page 5 of this testimony, please? Line 27, right at the bottom. Dr. Greenwood, here you stated that real-time management decisions based on fine-scale temporal and spatial monitoring of fish occurrence in the Delta will provide additional protection for fish species. Did I state that correctly?
Yes.
Is it correct that you testified in your direct testimony that real-time management actions will be focused on listed species?
They will.
The Fall Run Chinook is not a listed species, correct?
That's correct.
And you're aware that the McCollum River supports a Fall Run Chinook fishery?
Yes.
Are there any fine-scale temporal and spatial monitoring programs in existence today that could inform project operators about the presence of adult in-migrating Fall Run Chinook salmon near the Delta Cross Channel?
Did you say upstream migrating? Sorry,
Yes,
can you repeat the
adult,
question?
Adult in migrating. I can repeat. Are there any fine-scale temporal and spatial monitoring programs in existence today that could inform project operators about the presence of Delta, or about the presence of adult in-migrating fall run Chinook salmon within the area of the Delta Cross Channel?
I'm not aware of any that currently exist.
I'd like to ask you some questions about juvenile salmonids, and particularly how Waterfix may affect survival of outmigrating juveniles in the interior delta. Can we please see page 41 of Mr. Greenwood's testimony, Dr. Greenwood's testimony? Lines 6 through 8. This portion of your testimony states, overall, the CWF NMFSBO indicated that the CWF potentially could reduce through delta survival, increase travel times, and increase entry into the central delta where survival is lower. Is that correctly stated?
Yes, that's what it says.
Do you agree with these conclusions of the CWS NMFSBO?
Yes, I agree that CWF potentially could do those things.
On page 43, starting at line 10, you discuss a project environmental commitment, the head of Old River Gate, which you state would be constructed with the intent of keeping outmigrating juvenile salmonids in the San Joaquin River, along with other goals. Is that correct?
Yes.
Would the head of Old River Gate in any way help address the issue of fish entering the interior delta from east side delta tributaries, such as the McCollum River?
It may have a small effect on hydrodynamics. However, it's a very small effect, and well, it depends how far downstream from the gate. The effect would be potentially larger for the side tributaries that are farther upstream, but less of an effect downstream towards, for example, where McElmney River, Georgiana Slough meet the San Joaquin River. Yeah.
So the head of Old River Gate would have, at most, a small effect, if any, on preventing McCollum River outmigrating salmonids from entering the interior delta?
A small effect, but one that was looked at in terms of the analysis that we included in the biological assessment.
Do you recall what that analysis concluded?
Generally, that the hydrodynamics in that area where, for example, McElmney River salmonids, juvenile salmonids migrating downstream, where those coming from the McElmney River would meet the San Joaquin River, that the velocity in that region would be generally slightly greater compared to the no action alternative as a result of the head of Old River Gate. Similar or greater velocity as a result of the head of Old River Gate.
What effect would that change of velocity have on the amount of time that McCollum River juvenile salmon spend in the interior delta?
Potentially slightly reducing the amount of time spent in the interior delta. Although I don't believe that, I didn't specifically look at the amount of time analysis, but just based on velocity.
So it's fair to say that the head of Old River Gate then would not have a significant effect on travel time in the interior delta of McCollum River origin fish. Is that correct?
based solely on the hydrodynamics, under the assumption that that provides some representation of fish movement, which I think that there is some uncertainty regarding how well knowledge just of velocity, how that compares to the actual movement rates of fish, given that fish do have different behaviors that they're capable of. So the effect would be similar or potentially slightly greater travel time based purely on the assessment of the hydrodynamics from the DSM-2 hydro modeling.
And you're aware of the environmental commitment proposal to construct a non-physical barrier on Georgiana Slough if the Waterfix project is constructed, is that right?
Yeah, the non-physical barrier would be just at the entrance to Georgiana Slough from the Sacramento River.
Do you believe the non-physical barrier on Georgiana Slough will reduce the proportion of fish entering the interior delta?
Based on the pilot studies that have been undertaken in 2011 and 2012, it seems that there's good evidence that yes, the non-physical barrier, if the non-physical barrier implemented as was tested at the head of Georgiana Slough in those years I mentioned, it consisted of a non-physical barrier of that type, which was a bubble curtain with acoustic deterrence and flashing strobe lights. That type of barrier reduced the entry into the interior delta by 50 to 67%. And so it suggests that it could be effective.
A non-physical barrier in that location would be intended primarily to protect outmigrating juveniles from the Sacramento River and its tributaries. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Does the Georgiana Slough non-physical barrier address the issue of fish entering the interior delta from east side delta tributaries, such as the McCollum River?
No, it's primarily intended for fish, as you said, from the Sacramento River basin, Sacramento River and its tributaries.
So are you aware of any other Waterfix project environmental commitments that are directed towards reducing the proportion of McCollum origin juvenile fish from entering the interior delta?
No, I don't believe that there are any other environmental commitments of that nature.
And any that are directed towards addressing travel time impacts on McCollum origin juveniles as they transit the interior delta?
I'm not aware of any specific requirements of that nature. Other than just generally that there is overlap, as I mentioned, I think in my written testimony, there's overlap of the unlisted fall run from the McElmney River with the time period during which there are criteria applied for the listed salmonids from the for the listed salmonids.
Finally, I'd like to ask you about South Delta exports. Let's go to page 34 at lines 16 through 19. Here you stated that under the CWF H3 Plus project, there will be, quote, less use of the South Delta export facilities, which you claim could potentially result in reduced entrainment risk. Is that correct?
Yes.
What is the basis of your opinion that there will be less use of the South Delta export facilities if the Waterfix project is constructed?
Based on looking at the calcium modeling results, for example.
So you relied exclusively on modeling results to determine there would be less use?
Objection misstates the witness's testimony.
Okay, I'll ask it differently. Did you rely exclusively on modeling results to determine there would be less use of South Delta export facilities?
That was the primary consideration.
Did you mean there would be less use of South Delta export facilities at a particular time of year, or did you mean overall on average throughout the year, or something else?
It was specific to the different focal time periods for the species of interest. So, on the page that we're looking at, for example, there's an example of an analysis there of a particular analytical method that formed the basis for one of the bases for the opinion. And that method there is essentially applying the calcium modeling for South Delta exports to historical densities of fish that have been observed in salvage entrainment monitoring to make an assessment.
And among those species that you considered, did you consider Central Valley steelhead?
Yes, that's one of the species.
And fall run Chinook?
Yes.
Those two species generally outmigrate in the spring months through the interior delta, is that correct?
That's at least for fall run. I think with the steelhead, there may be some late winter as well as
Maybe a bit
early
earlier.
spring.
But generally there's overlap in when those two species migrate, and it's late winter through spring, is that correct?
Yes, I believe so.
Are you aware the McCullummy River supports populations of both Central Valley steelhead and fall run Chinook?
Yes.
Would you expect outmigrating juvenile McCullummy River, CV steelhead, and fall run Chinook to be present in the interior delta during April and May?
Yes, I believe so, based on my understanding.
If South Delta exports increase under project conditions during the specific months of April and May, do you believe that increase would tend to adversely impact the survival rate of outmigrating McCullummy River steelhead and fall run Chinook?
Objection. Relevance and assumes facts not in evidence. We're not discussing the existing facilities that are in place in the South Delta, and there's been no proposal to increase pumping from those facilities.
Mr. Salmon?
Well, I think it is relevant because while it's a hypothetical, I'm asking him if in fact there is an increase during those 2 months, which the witness said are months when these fish species are present near the pumps in the interior delta. I'm asking him, how would that affect the fish?
Overruled.
Can you, sorry, just so I get it right, can you repeat the question?
If South Delta exports increase under project conditions during the specific months of April and May, do you believe that increase would tend to adversely impact the survival rate of outmigrating McCullummy River steelhead and fall run Chinook?
I don't have an analysis for steelhead as far as a quantitative analysis that I'm aware of. Our analysis for fall run Chinook salmon in the BA from the McCullumny River does have a relationship between, albeit somewhat weak relationship between through delta survival and South Delta exports. So if there were, as far as the actual response, if there was such a change that you're asking about, I'm not sure. Our modeling analysis is based on there being a weak relationship. Whether or not that would be evident in reality, I'm not certain.
A weak relationship between
South Delta exports and through Delta survival.
what part of the modeling analysis are you referring to?
Appendix 5E.
In general, not just McCullummy River, but in general.
No, McCullumney River.
Well, I'm asking a different
Sorry.
question. In general, is the survival of steelhead and fall run Chinook correlated with South Delta export rates? In your opinion?
I'm not recalling for steelhead. And when, as far as general, are you meaning from any of the tributaries, or you said in general?
Yes.
Are you meaning generally from any of the tributaries, including the San Joaquin River, or?
How about east side tributaries?
I'm not. Our modeling did include an export survival relationship for McCullumney River specifically, McCullumney River, fall run Chinook salmon, which was actually based on the pathways taken by fish that had been actually released in the Sacramento River and then entered that pathway through McCullumney River. So we do have a relationship, we do have an analysis that actually tested for the effect of changes in South Delta exports on fish from the McCullumney River specifically.
And did that analysis show an inverse correlation between increasing South Delta exports and the rate of survival? In other words, survival rates decrease when exports increase. Is that what it showed?
That's what that's the fundamental model relationship. So if South Delta exports were greater, then that would be shown, with the caveat that the model actually, and this is the Delta Passage model that I'm talking about, the model actually, the study upon which it was based looked at the ratio, so the output, or the thing that was assessed, was the ratio in survival between the main stem Sacramento River and the interior delta. And it's the ratio that's captured in the model. So the ratio of those survivals is a thing that's captured in the model. And the lower Sacramento, and it depends on it depends on the flow or the survival in the lower Sacramento River as well. So it's sort of capturing the effects of two things at once: South Delta export changes as well as Sacramento River flow changes. But to the original question, I think it allows us to make an assessment of what the changes in South Delta exports would do to through Delta survival.
Thank you. No further questions.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. For the record, my name is Fred Etheridge. I'm from the General Counsel's Office of the East Bay Municipal Utility District. I'll begin with some questions for Mr. Miller. Okay, great. Mr. Miller, you are a state water project operator, is that correct?
That's correct.
Great. Mr. Baker, if you could please display Mr. Miller's testimony. It's DWR 1011, page 3. Line 7.
For the record, I believe it is Ms. Galen who's doing the documents right
Okay.
now.
Apologize. Is it your testimony that real-time operations are a key component of the proposed CWF H3 Plus operations?
Yes.
And in your oral testimony this morning, you mentioned that actual real-time operations of the SWP and CVP are made by people, correct?
I'm not sure if I mentioned CVP.
For the state water project, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So real people operate the state water project. That's
Right.
correct.
And it is your testimony that real-time operation, well, as opposed to being automated or computer-driven, I believe your point this morning was that people make the final decisions on operations. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And it is your testimony that real-time operation of the SWP and CVP respond to actual conditions, correct?
Yeah, and I can't really speak to the CVP. I'll have to
Okay.
point to Ms. White for CVP, but SWP, yes.
Okay. And Ms. White, is that true for the CVP as well?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
Sure. Is it your testimony that real-time operation of the CVP responds to actual conditions?
Yes.
Okay. So that, and this is back to Mr. Miller, so that operators make changes to SWP operations based on changing real-world, real-time conditions. Is that correct?
No, operators aren't changing real-world conditions.
But they're in response to changing real-world conditions. They're making decisions on operations. Is that correct?
Operators are making decisions based on real-world conditions.
Good, thank you. And is it your testimony that actual project operations may differ from the California Waterfix H3+ modeling? Is that correct?
Not exactly. So,
Can
so
you-
the, so the well, maybe, can you ask that question again? I'm sorry.
Well, this morning in your testimony, after explaining that human beings made the final operating decisions, you also talked about the CWF H3+ modeling. Is that correct?
Yes,
And that at times actual project operations may differ from those displayed in CWF H3+ modeling. Is that correct?
well, the modeling is simulating the actions of the operators. So, but the operators are following the criteria laid out, and so is the model. But the model is doing the simulating of what the operators' decisions will be, or would be.
But in the final real-world operation of the state water project, might it differ from that in the future displayed in the CWF H3+ modeling?
Maybe I'm not understanding your difference. Can you speak that one more time?
Well, in the modeling for CWF H3+, the modeling made certain assumptions. Is that correct?
Yes.
But might it be possible that for actual real-world state water project operations, that those operations would in some situations differ from the assumptions in the CWF H3+ modeling?
Oh, right. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
But it would should be within the bounds of what the model is trying to simulate.
Okay. I'm going to ask some questions also on page 3 of your testimony, lines 9 and 10. Do SWP operators receive input from multi-agency groups to, quote, inform and guide the operations for protection of listed fish species?
Yes.
What about non-listed fish species?
I'm not sure all the species that the DOS looks at. The Delta operations for salmon and sturgeon.
So you're not sure whether that DOS team looks at non-listed species?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
But
If we could turn to page 5 of Mr. Miller's testimony on lines 9 to 11. I'm going to read from this. There are several technical teams that gather information on operations and specific fish species and assess potential impacts and provide that assessment to the regulatory agencies and the WOMT as a whole. And the WOMT refers to the Water Operations Management Team. Is that correct?
and that's correct.
And in your reference to the specific fish species, in lines 9 and 10 from that section that I just read, does that include McCallum River, Fall Run, Chinook salmon?
I'm not sure exactly what fish, all the fish species that the DOS looks at.
Okay, thank you. Do you know if the DOS team considers up-migrating fall run Chinook salmon in regard to the Delta cross-channel operations?
I am not aware of if they look at that or not.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Miller, as you earlier noted, your testimony discusses real-time operations and decision-making. Is that correct?
Yes.
Are you aware of any real-time SWP or CVP monitoring processes that are used to reduce impacts to salmon during the October-November period?
I am aware of the NIMS biological opinion that has some actions in October, November.
Excellent. You anticipated my next question. You mentioned in your testimony this morning the Knight's Landing Catch Index. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that index is contained in the 2009 NIMS biological opinion?
I believe so.
Okay. Are you aware that that biological opinion includes action triggers to close the Delta cross channel if a specified trigger, such as the Knight's Landing Catch Index, is exceeded?
Yes, I'm aware that there is some Knight's Landing Catch Index based trigger for the Delta cross channel.
Okay. So there's, it would be fair to say there's two parts to that. First, there's some monitoring that occurs, and that being the Knight's Landing Catch Index. Is that correct?
That sounds correct. I may have to look to some of the biologists to look if they are more familiar with that action.
Certainly, certainly.
Dr. Greenwood, do you?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Well, we're speaking of the Knight's Landing Catch Index in the NIMS 2009 biological opinion. Are you familiar with that?
I'm familiar, yes.
So, and that same biological opinion includes a trigger requiring the closure of the Delta cross channel if the Knight's Landing Catch Index exceeds a certain amount. Is that correct?
I believe so, although I don't recall the specifics.
Okay. So would it be fair to summarize that existing regulatory process, that it contains 3 steps? First, monitoring; second, a trigger; and third, a responsive corrective action as a trigger is exceeded. Is that correct?
Question to me.
Well, whoever can answer it.
That sounds correct.
Okay, good. Thank you. Do you know if these processes that we've just described from the 2009 biological opinion focus on preventing juvenile Sacramento River run salmon from entrainment into the Central Delta?
I think Sacramento River Basin, so including the Sacramento River as well as its tributaries.
Okay, thank you. Are you aware of any existing real-time SWP or CVP monitoring and operating processes that could be used to reduce impacts from strain of up-migrating adult McCallum River Chinook salmon through the Delta cross channel?
I'm not specifically aware. I think it sounds like a very similar question to the one I answered earlier.
Well, we've just spoken of the existing standard in the NIMS 2009 biological opinion regarding the Knight's Landing Catch Index, correct?
Yes.
And that, as you mentioned a couple of minutes ago, was designed to protect Sacramento Basin out-migrating juvenile salmonids. Is that correct?
Yes.
So what I'm asking here is if there's any parallel existing monitoring and operating processes that could be used, that is used, to limit strain of up-migrating McCallum River Chinook salmon through the Delta cross channel?
I'm not aware of any.
Okay, thank you. Do you know if under the California Waterfix project, will there be any real-time state water project or CVP monitoring and operating processes that could be used to reduce strain of up-migrating adult fall run McCollum River Chinook salmon through the Delta Cross Channel?
Are you meaning biological monitoring or?
Well, you've spoken earlier about the existing Knight's Landing Catch Index and the 2009 biological opinion, correct?
Yes, for downstream migrating
Right. So I'm
juveniles.
referring now to a different species. Whether under the Waterfix project, is it proposed there be any real-time state water project or CVP monitoring and operating processes that could be used to reduce strain of up-migrating adult fall run McCollum River Chinook salmon through the Delta Cross Channel?
Nothing is proposed to specifically address that potential impact.
Okay, thank you. I next have some questions for Mr. Wilder.
Let me check in with the court reporter. You okay? All right.
And Mr. Wilder's testimony is DWR Exhibit 1013 signed. I know there are different versions of it, but it's the 1013 signed. Mr. Wilder, your testimony refers to the Sacramento, Feather, and American rivers. Is that correct?
Primarily, although I also report on the Trinity and Clear Creek to some extent.
Okay, thank you. Are those the rivers your testimony analyzes?
Yes.
Does your testimony look at any other rivers?
The final EIS also evaluated the San Joaquin River as well as the McCollum River.
But does your testimony touch upon the McCollum River?
No, and the reason is that it was discussed during part one of these hearings that there are no effects on any of the San Joaquin River, the main stem or its tributaries, and therefore I chose not to even bother.
Okay.
And you can look in my in the final EIR to confirm that.
Now, your testimony looks at project impacts on upstream fisheries, as distinguished from Mr. Greenwood's testimony that focused on delta fisheries. Is that correct?
Yes.
If we could turn to page 4 of Mr. Wilder's testimony. And line 5 here is a header, which is the analytical approach to testimony. Do you see that?
Yes.
Is it your opinion, let's just shift down now to page 4, lines 6 through 8. Is it your opinion that, quote, my testimony provides the basis for my opinion that the CWF H3 Plus is reasonably protective of upstream fishes?
That is my testimony.
Okay, thank you. Is the McCollum River fall run Chinook salmon an upstream fishery?
The McCollum River is upstream of the legal delta, yes.
Did you examine the project's impacts on McCollum River salmonids?
Yes, as I mentioned, it's included in the final EIS,
Okay.
which I cite extensively in this document.
Okay, thank you. In your analytic work in preparing your testimony for this proceeding, did you visit any of the rivers in question and do habitat studies?
I'm sorry, could you clarify?
In the analytic work that you performed in preparing your testimony for this proceeding, did you do any field visits to any of the rivers in question to do some habitat analysis or biological analysis?
Not specifically for this testimony, no.
Okay. On page 4 of your testimony, lines 19 through 20, what do you mean by this statement that, quote, the only mechanism by which CWF can affect waterways upstream of the delta is through changes in CVP and SWP reservoir operations caused by the project?
What I mean is that reservoir operations are the only mechanism through which the upstream reservoirs can be, the upstream waterways can be affected. And that's only done by changes in flows and to some extent downstream changes in temperatures beyond downstream of the reservoirs.
Okay, thank you. Does the Delta Cross Channel, a CVP facility, affect fisheries?
That's beyond the scope of my testimony, but yes, it does.
So is it true then that the only mechanism by which the Waterfix project can affect waterways upstream of the Delta is through CVP and SWP reservoir operations?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Well, if the Delta Cross Channel, which is a CVP facility, can affect fisheries, is it true that the only mechanism by which the Waterfix can affect waterways upstream of the Delta is through changes in CVP and SWP reservoir operations?
Yes, I stand by my statement. It says waterways, not fisheries.
Okay. That concludes my questions. Thank you.
That concludes your cross-examination.
It does.
Now, I have a dilemma. I said you would be the last one, but you're done early. Let me ask, Group 18, are you prepared to conduct your 20-minute cross-examination? Thank you. Excellent. Do you need to take a 5-minute break? Nope, you're good. All right, we're moving full steam ahead. So then tomorrow, we will begin with Group 25, the County of Solano. Uh-oh. Maybe not.
Hi, Curtis Keller for Contra Costa County. I'm also part of that Group 25, along with Solano County.
Okay.
If this will be the last cross-examination that occurs today, could I make the request to go in the afternoon tomorrow? Group 25 could go in the afternoon tomorrow. We have Board of Supervisors meetings in the morning tomorrow. Our attempt was to hope to go today, but if not, the afternoon would.
Well, that depends on Mr. Herrick, who I no longer see in the audience. And 24. And Ms. Meserve. Ms. Meserve, are you able to go in the morning?
Yeah, I can do that if necessary, and then I could also inquire as to groups 24, Mr. Keeling and Mr. Herrick, if they prefer to go in the morning, or we'll work it out and let you know in the morning. Would that be acceptable?
Well, I think he needs to know now.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we will accommodate so we'd be happy to move things around so that he can go in the afternoon.
Well, the answer to your
So-
question then is if groups 21, 24, and Ms. Meserve can go in the morning, then we will get to you in the afternoon.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
You owe them. All right. We will now turn to Group 18.
Thank you. Tim Waszewski for the San Joaquin Tributaries Authority. I will have questions for Mr. Reyes and Ms. White. If we could go to Mr. Reyes' testimony, which is DWR 1016, and then go to page 6, please. So, Mr. Reyes, I'm going to direct your attention to line 2, where it says, as in H3 and H4 and the BA H3 Plus included new OMR flow requirements and South Delta export restrictions during October and November compared to the NAA. And then the next sentence says, in the CWF H3 Plus scenario, these OMR flow requirements and South Delta export restrictions were removed. Would you agree that export restrictions have an effect on Delta outflow? It's not directly related to the sentence I just
Apologize.
read.
Yeah, was getting thrown off by the sentence above. Okay, so
Okay.
you're just asking, does
Yeah, so I want you to keep that sentence in mind, and then the question is, do you agree that export restrictions have an effect on delta outflow?
it can?
Right, because when delta exports are higher, the delta outflow is lower, assuming nothing else changes, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So that's why, if we go to page 7 of Mr. Reyes' testimony, please. So that's why you say on line 5 that the CWF H3 plus delta outflows are slightly lower than the BA H3 plus results in October. Is that correct? Is that what, I guess the question is that the reason?
Yes, I believe it is.
Okay.
You have different requirements in October between the Cal Waterfix H3 plus and the BA H3 plus, just to be clear.
Okay, so if the South Delta export restrictions were also removed for November, which is what you said on page 6, why shouldn't we expect that delta outflow would also be lower in November, but you only referenced October? Shouldn't we expect it to also be lower in November is the question.
Not necessarily. Like I said, it's a factor, not the only factor.
What if everything else was the same?
Right, if everything else was the same, but I'm
So
not
what-
sure it was in the model, so.
Is it possible that one of the differences was the amount of San Joaquin River inflow? If you don't know, that's an acceptable answer.
Yeah, I mean, if San Joaquin inflow was higher, would the outflow be higher? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, you said that in November, delta outflow wouldn't necessarily be lower because there are other factors. And I'm asking you, in the modeling, did you increase San Joaquin River inflow to account for that?
No, I don't believe we did.
So why is it then that in November we don't see the same decrease in delta outflow that you saw in October, or that you reported seeing in October?
I'm not sure. I'd have to look at the modeling. I'm just saying that the exports alone, having a lower requirement in November doesn't necessarily mean that was going to translate to increased exports or more outflow.
Hi, this is Kristen White. Can I jump in and add something real quick? I think
Sure.
we're confusing export restrictions and the actual exports. So export restrictions only make a difference if that's what's controlling. So if those export restrictions weren't controlling the exports in November, then you won't see any difference.
But the ability to export more would still be there? Or
Well, something else would have been controlling. So no. I mean, we would have to look into the model results, but export restrictions are only going to make a difference if they're physically controlling the exports.
Okay,
Does that make sense?
thank you. Let's go to page 8, please, of Mr. Reyes' testimony, and line 6. So that says, based on my analysis and the results shown below, it's my opinion that the CWF H3 plus scenario meets D1641 Fish and Wildlife and the 2008-2009 BO requirements, and then you list a variety of the requirements that are supposedly satisfied. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
Okay, I want to address D1641 first, and then we'll move to the biological opinions. So I noticed in that list of the D1641 requirements that you say, or that you analyzed and reported on, you didn't mention the vernalis requirement on the San Joaquin River. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So did you analyze whether or not the vernalis requirement would be met under CWF H3+?
Yeah, it's I forget what the specific operating criteria is in the model. If we have the most up-to-date version of 1641, but the criteria that we put forth for meeting San Joaquin salinity is being met. Yes.
So it's assumed, well, I'm talking about the, you mentioned salinity, I'm talking about the flow requirement for analysis. So are you assuming in the analysis that that's being met?
Yeah, I believe so.
So that's the underlying assumption, is that San Joaquin River inflow is meeting D1641 requirements.
Yes. Yeah.
So if that assumption was not correct, would that change your opinion as to whether the delta outflow requirement would be met under CWF H3+?
The outflow requirements?
Yes, because the delta outflow requirement is, delta outflow is one of the components is inflow from both the Sacramento and San Joaquin. So if the Vernalis requirement was not in fact being met, would that change your opinion as to whether or not the outflow requirement was being met?
And I'm going to object. At this point, San Joaquin Tributaries Authority has gone well beyond the scope of the Cal Waterfix. This is a line of questioning they attempted to conduct a number of times in Part 1. The California Waterfix doesn't propose any changes to the San Joaquin system, and to imply that the modeling was somehow addressing a shift in the release of San Joaquin reservoirs is incorrect. And I'm not sure that there's a basis now to continue this line of questioning when it's outside of all of the proposed project impacts.
Your response?
Yes, the modeling has been changed several times now. I'm asking about CWF H3+, and the assumptions that went into the conclusions that net delta outflow was satisfied and that a variety of other components, or requirements were satisfied, and whether or not those conclusions were based on an assumption that the flow at Vernalis was compliant with D1641, because if it was not, that could impact other the satisfaction of other requirements. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but I want to figure that out.
Mr. Reyes, was there any change in the modeling of the San Joaquin component from what was presented in Part 1
No, there was.
to this current CWF H3+?
So there was no change in our modeling of the San Joaquin as far as it relates to 1641 since Part 1, and also the no action alternative case actually has the same criteria as the Cal Waterfix. There's no change there.
And there's no change in either the modeling or the operational criteria applied.
That's correct.
I will sustain the objection.
Okay. So I won't ask with regard to delta outflow then, but what exactly am I being precluded from? Because I didn't fully understand the objection, I guess.
The objection was that there was no change from the modeling presented in Part 1 to this current version of CWF. We've got to find a shorter name for this. H3+ with respect to the San Joaquin River operations.
Okay. So you may have answered this question then, based on your other responses. Did you run any analysis as part of CWF H3+ to see what delta outflow would be if the Vernalis requirement was not being met?
Objection.
If he can just confirm that or not.
Yeah, just go ahead and answer.
No, I did not.
Did you do any analysis to see whether CWF H3+ would comply with the EI ratio if the Vernalis requirement was not being met?
No, I did not.
Are you aware of the testimony and the evidence that's been presented in this hearing showing that there's a long history of noncompliance with D1641 ad vernalis?
Objection. Non-compliance, unimplemented standard. We haven't established that there is a non-compliance at Vernals.
That was not his question, I believe.
Have you reviewed the testimony from Dan Steiner from part 1 of this hearing, which shows that there is a long history of noncompliance with the vernalis requirement under D1641?
That was a while ago, so I'm unclear if I reviewed that or not.
You said that there were no changes to how the San Joaquin River inflow, how the San Joaquin River was analyzed, and that the assumption was that D1641 would be met at vernalis. Who made the decision to use that assumption in the analysis?
What assumption are you referring to?
I believe you said earlier that the assumption essentially is that the vernalis requirement at D1641 is satisfied and that no further analysis was done.
Yeah, I guess that's what I said. Okay.
So do you know who made the decision to input the analysis of the vernalis requirement being satisfied?
There's a criteria in the model that is what we're calling 1641, and the model satisfies the criteria that it's essentially forced to meet, or not forced to, but that it's trying to meet.
Okay. Do you know where the water comes from to meet that? Because there's several sources on the San Joaquin River. Do you know which sources of water are being used to meet that requirement?
Objection, relevance. Again, we're up on the San Joaquin system. The model treats the San Joaquin system identically under the no project alternative in the California Waterfix. It's factored out at that point.
So the answer, Mr. Rice, to the question would be no? Or
I
do
don't
you
think
know?
it's maybe it is a yes or no. Do you know where the water comes from?
It would be water that's from the San Joaquin River system. I mean, which could come from any of the tribs. I mean, there's no way of telling the exact proportion of which tributary contributes how much, but all of those, I think, contribute some.
Does any of the water come from behind Friant Dam as part of the San Joaquin River Restoration Program?
You may repeat that you do not know.
I do not know.
Okay, if we could pull up Ms. White's testimony, which is DOI 40. It's DOI, not DWR. So I don't know if you can see that screen. The last sentence of your testimony, Ms. White, says, I'm able to answer technical questions regarding the use of calcium to model and analyze CVP operations and how components from the modeling may be operationalized within the CVP. So I'm going to take you up on that and ask you some technical questions on that. If we could pull up SJTA 302. This is the written testimony of Dan Steiner that's been submitted by the SJTA as part of this part 2 of this proceeding. Have you reviewed that?
I have not.
Okay. I'm going to ask you then if you agree with the general premise of this, which I can summarize for you. But if you can scroll down to the first paragraph there so that she can also take a look at it. The biological assessment incorporates climate change into its analysis. Do you agree with that?
I would defer to the modelers, but I assume it includes the Q5 climate scenario. That's considered climate change under Mr. Steiner's testimony.
Yeah, the BA modeling does include Q5 climate assumptions.
Okay. And that could increase the frequency at which we see dry and critically dry years. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, but I would refer to our modelers on what that would look like.
It changes the temperature and some of the timing of the inflow and the precipitation patterns change, but whether it increases the frequency of the dry or critical periods, I'd have to look at the data, but it's there. We have those defined, so I don't know exactly if it increases it or not.
So you don't know if by incorporating climate change, you're showing more dry and critical years than you would if you didn't incorporate climate change?
Not without having to do a little bit of analysis first, no.
So since the flow requirements at places like Vernalis and others in the D1641 are lower in dry and critical years, the use of climate change in the analysis essentially means that compliance with those requirements under the BA can be achieved more often without having to resort to stored water because the requirements themselves are lower. Have you looked into that?
I think, to me, I don't believe what you're saying there, which is that the requirements are based on year types, which are defined by how much inflow reaches a certain system or water supply indices, and those were developed without regard to climate change. So essentially, if you have a wet year, you will know that by the index telling you how much inflow you have in the system, and then there are requirements that are based on these water supply indices, and so it's based on the water supply. It doesn't really have to do with if climate change affected how the system might be different in the future. If it's drier, then you would have less supply, which then you would follow the requirement that says for a less supply you have such and such requirement that you have to adhere to.
So by incorporating climate change, you will show less supply, which means that you could be bumped into a drier year type classification, which would essentially lower the requirements that the projects have to meet.
It wouldn't lower the requirements. It would bump you into the correct category of what you're required to meet.
Okay, yes, it would bump you into a category which has lower requirements. Can we agree
Objection
on that?
misstates the testimony of
I'm
the
asking him
witness.
if we could agree on that. Can we
Then
agree on that?
objection asked and answered.
Hold on. What was the question again?
I asked Mr. Reyes if we could agree that it could having more dry year types. Excuse me. I guess I asked Mr. Reyes if we could agree that the climate change will give you more dry year water year classifications, which will
Hold on,
in turn.
stop right there.
Sure.
I thought, my recollection was your answer that was you didn't know.
That's correct. I haven't analyzed if it's more frequent that we're having drier year types.
But if it were the case, the requirements would be lower. I mean, the requirements would be what they are for the water year type, but they would be lower because drier water years have lower requirements. Can we agree on that?
I would say the requirement is a suite of requirements that change according to water supply, and those are unchanged.
Okay. My time's up, so thank you.
I'm still trying to understand your last question, but okay. All right, I think that will wrap us up for today. I thought I saw Mr. Herrick made an appearance. Ms. Meserve, were you able to confirm? That was a yes? All right. So we will begin tomorrow back in the coastal hearing room with Mr. Herrick conducting his cross-examination. Thank you.